May 10, 1940. The morning sun rose over London to reveal a city balanced on the edge of catastrophe. While most Britons still slept, German panzers had already begun their westward thrust into Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The long-anticipated storm had finally broken. In Whitehall, inside the corridors of power, another drama was reaching its climax. At precisely 6 o'clock that evening, a 65-year-old man with a bulldog face and a lifetime of controversy trailing behind him walked into Buckingham Palace. Neville Chamberlain had just tendered his resignation to King George VI, and now Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill stood before his sovereign to accept the king's commission to form a new government. The man many considered a dangerous maverick, a reckless warmonger, a political outcast who had spent the previous decade shouting warnings that went unheeded. This man now held the fate of the British Empire in his hands. As Churchill later wrote, he felt as though all his past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. What neither he nor anyone else could know was that within 16 days, he would face a choice that would determine not merely his own political survival, but whether Britain would continue to exist as a free nation or become another conquest in Adolf Hitler's empire. The desperate problem facing Churchill was almost incomprehensible in its magnitude. Britain stood on the precipice of total defeat. The military situation was catastrophic beyond anything the modern world had witnessed. Within days of Churchill's appointment, the German blitzkrieg had shattered the French and British defensive lines with a speed and ferocity that defied all pre-war calculations. The French High Command, once considered the finest military minds in Europe, had been outmaneuvered and psychologically broken. The British Expeditionary Force, the cream of Britain's professional army, some 400,000 men who represented years of training and Britain's primary military investment, found themselves cut off and retreating toward a small coastal town called Dunkirk. By May 22, German tanks had reached the English Channel, and the pocket into which Allied forces were compressed grew smaller by the hour. Lord Gort, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, sent increasingly desperate messages to London predicting total disaster. He doubted that more than a small percentage of his men could be saved. The equipment losses would be total, every tank, every artillery piece, every vehicle would have to be abandoned. Britain would be left virtually defenseless, with a demoralized remnant of an army and an island that lay tantalizingly close to German airfields across the Channel. The Chiefs of Staff had prepared a brutally honest assessment titled British Strategy in a Certain Eventuality. The report concluded that if Germany gained a secure foothold in Britain, resistance would be impossible. Germany's air superiority was calculated at approximately 4-1. The Royal Navy could provide breathing space, but if the Luftwaffe achieved air supremacy, invasion would become inevitable. Britain faced a simple arithmetic of survival. Without the Royal Air Force maintaining control of the skies, the nation would fall. Without American assistance, which seemed impossibly distant, Britain could not hope to win the war. The statistics were grimmer still. In mid-September 1940, RAF Fighter Command could field just over 800 operational fighters against a Luftwaffe that possessed more than 4,000 aircraft, including 1,107 single-seat fighters and 1,380 medium bombers. Britain had lost 68,111 men of the BEF during the Blitzkrieg, retreat, and evacuation. The professional army that had taken years to build had been shattered in a matter of weeks. Yet the most dangerous threat Churchill faced in those first days was not German but British, and it came from within his own war cabinet. This was where the unlikely architect of potential surrender emerged, a man of impeccable establishment credentials, a devout Christian, a former Viceroy of India, and the man who had very nearly become Prime Minister instead of Churchill, Edward Wood, 1st Earl of Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. Halifax was everything Churchill was not: refined, aristocratic, deeply pessimistic about Britain's chances, and convinced that negotiation was the only rational course. He had served as Viceroy of India from 1926 to 1931, where he had exercised power from a position of strength over subject peoples. Now he found himself in the reverse position, facing a ruthless aggressor from a position of profound weakness, and his instinct was to negotiate, to preserve what could be preserved, to ensure Britain's survival even if it meant accepting German domination of continental Europe. Halifax believed that Britain, like Spain or Switzerland or Sweden, could remain autonomous while Germany controlled the rest of Europe. To him, this was realism. To Churchill, it was the extinction of everything Britain represented. Halifax was not alone in his pessimism. Many in the Conservative Party, still the dominant force in Parliament, distrusted Churchill deeply. His reputation preceded him like a shadow. The disaster at Gallipoli in 1915 had nearly ended his career permanently. As First Lord of the Admiralty during World War I, Churchill had championed an audacious plan to knock Turkey out of the war by forcing the Dardanelles Strait and capturing Constantinople. The campaign became a textbook example of catastrophic failure. Insufficient planning, underestimation of Turkish defenses, terrible coordination between naval and land forces, and delays that allowed German officers to strengthen Turkish positions all contributed to a disaster that cost tens of thousands of Allied lives. A 1916 Commission report stated bluntly that sufficient consideration was not given to the measures necessary to carry out such an expedition with success. Churchill was dismissed from the Admiralty, his colleagues and the media making him the scapegoat for the failure. His tendency to act beyond his powers, to present his cabinet colleagues with fait accompli, to plunge recklessly ahead without adequate consideration of risks. These character flaws, as they were seen, had been confirmed by Gallipoli. Then had come the wilderness years, the decade from 1929 to 1939, when Churchill found himself cast out from government, regarded as an alarmist, a warmonger, a man whose judgment could not be trusted. Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, the conservative leaders of that era, considered him unpredictable and self-promoting. Churchill's fierce opposition to granting India self-government made him appear reactionary and out of touch. His warnings about German rearmament, which began as early as 1936, were dismissed as the ravings of a man obsessed with military conflict. While Chamberlain pursued appeasement and signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, Churchill stood almost alone in Parliament denouncing the betrayal of Czechoslovakia and warning that Hitler's appetite would never be satisfied. By 1937, in his book Great Contemporaries, Churchill had written directly to the British public about Hitler. If we look only at the past, which is all we have to judge by, we must indeed feel anxious. Hitherto, Hitler's triumphant career has been borne onwards, not only by a passionate love of Germany, but by currents of hatred so intense as to sear the souls of those who swim upon them. Those who knew Churchill understood that his warnings came from a complex, troubled psyche. He suffered from severe recurring depression, which he called his black dog. Professor Burt Park and other psychiatrists who have studied Churchill believe he exhibited signs of cyclothymia, a condition characterized by alternating periods of depression and abnormally elevated mood and energy. This explained both his prophetic insights and his catastrophic misjudgments. During his manic phases, Churchill displayed extraordinary energy, creativity, and persuasive charisma that could convince colleagues to support ventures that more cautious minds would reject. During his depressive phases, he spoke of standing too close to railroad platform edges, fearing he might throw himself in front of a train. Churchill himself once told his secretary John Martin, "You know, I may seem to be very fierce, but I am fierce only with one man, Hitler." This was not mere rhetoric. Churchill had engaged in a personal psychological war against Hitler that transcended normal diplomatic or military considerations. The battle of development, Churchill's struggle to build support for continued resistance, began the moment he became Prime Minister. On May 13, 1940, just 3 days after taking office, Churchill faced the House of Commons for the first time as Prime Minister. The speech he delivered would become one of the most famous in history, yet its reception at the time revealed how tenuous his position truly was. He told his cabinet earlier that day, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." When he repeated this phrase to Parliament, the response was divided. Labour members were enthusiastic, but the Conservative reaction was notably lukewarm. They still wanted Neville Chamberlain, who remained leader of the Conservative Party. Churchill understood the grim reality. As he commented to General Ismay, poor people, they trust me, and I can give them nothing but disaster for quite a long time." The full text of his speech laid out the ordeal ahead with brutal honesty. "We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I can say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory, victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. But survival itself was the question being debated behind closed doors as May progressed and the military situation deteriorated. The enemy's fatal blind spot, Hitler's inability to comprehend British resolve, became paradoxically both Britain's salvation and its greatest danger. Hitler had long held contradictory views about Britain. Before the war, he had expressed admiration for the British Empire and hoped to forge an alliance, believing that Britain would see Germany as a bulwark against Bolshevism. He wanted Britain to acknowledge German dominance on the continent while maintaining its imperial possessions. Hitler's strategic vision involved turning east toward Russia for Lebensraum, living space, not engaging in a prolonged conflict with the British. Churchill recognized this and made a prophetic statement in July 1940 to his Assistant Secretary John Colville. Hitler must invade or fail. If he fails, he is bound to go east, and fail he will. Hitler's generals were deeply concerned about Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. The Wehrmacht had no experience with amphibious operations on such a scale, and the Royal Navy remained a formidable obstacle. Hitler's directive on May 31, 1940, gave the all-clear to begin preparations, but throughout June and July he continued to hope that Britain would make peace, rendering invasion unnecessary. The reversal, the battlefield shock that would define the war's trajectory, began not with a victory but with a miraculous escape. On May 26, 1940, at 6:57 p.m., Vice Admiral Ramsay in Dover received the signal to commence Operation Dynamo. The evacuation of Dunkirk had begun. Over the next 9 days, an armada of 933 ships, Royal Navy destroyers, merchant vessels, fishing boats, pleasure craft, anything that could float and cross the channel, converged on the beaches and harbor of Dunkirk. Under constant Luftwaffe bombardment and artillery fire, the evacuation proceeded with desperate urgency. On the first day, May 27th, only 7,669 men were rescued from the harbor. But the operation gained momentum. By May 29th, 47,310 men had been evacuated. On May 31st, the number reached 68,014 in a single day. German forces were advancing, squeezing the perimeter tighter. Hitler had ordered his panzers to halt on May 24th, a decision that remains one of the most debated in military history, giving the British precious extra time. By June 4th, when the operation concluded, 338,226 Allied troops had been saved, 198,000 British, and 140,000 French and Belgian soldiers. The cost was severe. 236 ships were lost, 61 put out of action, 126 merchant seamen died, and 40,000 French troops remained trapped when Dunkirk finally fell. Yet it was between May 26th and May 28th, while Dunkirk hung in the balance, that the most critical battle occurred, not on the beaches of France but in the cabinet rooms of Whitehall. This was the 1940 British War Cabinet crisis, 3 days that determined whether Britain would fight on or seek terms with Hitler. The crisis erupted when Halifax, supported by elements within the cabinet, proposed that Britain explore the possibility of a negotiated peace settlement with Hitler's ally, Mussolini, acting as intermediary. On Saturday, May 25th, Halifax had met with Giuseppe Bastianini, the Italian ambassador, and sent a report stating that matters which cause anxiety to Italy must certainly be discussed as part of the general European settlement. France was collapsing, and French Premier Paul Reynaud visited London on Sunday, May 26th, requesting that Britain join France in approaching Mussolini to broker peace terms. The War Cabinet met 7 times between May 26th and May 28th, and the minutes of those meetings reveal a government on the edge of dissolution. Churchill's position was precarious. He was not the leader of the Conservative Party. Chamberlain was, and he needed Chamberlain's support or the Conservative majority in Parliament could force his resignation. The War Cabinet consisted of 5 members: Churchill, Halifax, Chamberlain, and 2 Labour Party members, Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood. Churchill also invited Sir Archibald Sinclair, leader of the Liberal Party, to attend to strengthen his position. At the 9 a.m. meeting on Sunday, May 26, Halifax raised the issue directly. He stated that, on the broader issue, we must face the fact that it is not so much now a question of imposing a complete defeat upon Germany but of safeguarding the independence of our own empire and if possible that of France. Churchill replied firmly, "Peace and security might be achieved under a German domination of Europe, that we could never accept. We must ensure our complete liberty and independence." The confrontation intensified on Monday, May 27, at the 4:30 p.m. meeting. Halifax presented a memorandum proposing that Britain and France jointly approach Mussolini, offering to include Italy in settlement of all European issues in exchange for Italian mediation with Hitler. Churchill spoke decisively, saying that an approach to Mussolini would be futile, dangerous, and ruinous to the integrity of Britain's fighting position. He insisted that Britain must not be dragged down the slippery slope with France. The best help Britain could give France was to show them that, whatever happened, Britain was going to fight it out to the end. Churchill's peroration captured his entire philosophy. If the worst came to the worst, it would not be a bad thing for this country to go down fighting for the other countries which had been overcome by Nazi tyranny. Halifax was incensed. He challenged Churchill, accusing him of changing his position from the previous day and declaring that while he did not believe Hitler would make an acceptable offer, while it was still possible to obtain an acceptable settlement, he could not agree with Churchill's stated intention to fight to the finish. The meeting, by all accounts except the sanitized official minutes, was stormy. Halifax threatened to resign. If he did, and if Chamberlain followed, Churchill's government would collapse. Historian Anthony Beevor wrote that this meeting perhaps encapsulated the most critical moment of the war, when Nazi Germany might have won. Churchill had the full support of Attlee, Greenwood, and Sinclair. Chamberlain remained cautiously between the two positions. He did not trust Mussolini and thought negotiations pointless, but he feared alienating France. That evening, Churchill spoke with Halifax in the garden at 10 Downing Street and managed to calm him. But Churchill knew he needed something more decisive. On May 28, Churchill made his masterstroke. He called a meeting of his 25-member outer cabinet, ministers not in the war cabinet but part of the government. To them, he delivered a passionate speech. He told them that if France could not continue the struggle, Britain would fight on alone. He spoke of the horrors of Nazi occupation, of a Britain subjugated and enslaved. Then he declared, "If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." The outer cabinet erupted in support. Ministers crowded around Churchill, patting him on the back, expressing unanimous determination to fight on. Halifax had been outmaneuvered. When the war cabinet reconvened, the political reality had shifted. Chamberlain now firmly supported Churchill. Halifax recognized that his proposal had been rejected. He accepted defeat, though he remained Foreign Secretary until December 1940 when Churchill appointed him ambassador to the United States, an honorable exile. The expansion and multi-role impact of Churchill's decision to fight manifested immediately in both word and deed. On June 4, 1940, as the last ships returned from Dunkirk, Churchill addressed the House of Commons again. This speech, known as "We Shall Fight on the Beaches," had to accomplish multiple objectives. He had to describe a military disaster honestly while maintaining morale, warn of possible invasion while expressing confidence in victory, and prepare the nation for France's imminent collapse while encouraging France to continue fighting. Churchill acknowledged the reality. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. But then he built toward his thunderous conclusion. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end, we shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Legend has it that immediately after this speech, Churchill turned to a colleague and whispered, "And we'll fight them with the butt ends of broken beer bottles because that's bloody well all we've got." This captures the desperate reality behind the rhetoric. Britain had rescued its army but lost nearly all its equipment. The nation was essentially disarmed, facing the most powerful military machine in the world across a narrow channel of water. France fell with stunning speed. On June 16th, the French government requested an armistice. 2 days later, on June 18th, Churchill delivered his third great speech of this period, known as their finest hour. The manuscript shows his careful crafting of every phrase, the rhetorical flourishes designed for maximum impact when broadcast to the nation. He acknowledged the disasters of the previous fortnight, reminded Parliament that he had warned them the worst possibilities were open, and declared that whatever happened in France would make no difference to the resolve of Britain and the British Empire to fight on, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. Then came the passage that would echo through history. What General Vagon called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister, and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. The psychological aftermath of Churchill's defiance manifested in Hitler's confused and angry response. Hitler had genuinely expected Britain to negotiate. He delayed Operation Sea Lion through June and July, hoping Churchill would see reason. On July 19, 1940, in a speech to the Reichstag, Hitler's frustration erupted. Mr. Churchill has only now again declared that he wants war. I am clearly aware that our coming answer might bring nameless suffering and misfortune to people. Naturally not to Herr Churchill, because he will then surely be sitting in Canada. The personal animosity was unmistakable. Then, on September 4th, after Churchill had ordered RAF Bomber Command to strike Berlin, a raid that inflicted minimal damage but enormous psychological impact, Hitler spoke at the Sportpalast Arena. American journalist William Shirer was in the audience and recorded Hitler's words. Mr. Churchill is carrying out these raids not because they promise to be highly effective, but because his Air Force cannot fly over Germany in daylight. For 3 months I did not answer because I believed that such madness would be stopped. Mr. Churchill took this for a sign of weakness. We are now answering night for night. Hitler then shifted Luftwaffe strategy from attacking RAF airfields to bombing London's civilian population. A decision that likely saved fighter command from collapse and ensured Germany would lose the Battle of Britain. Galeazzo Ciano, Italy's foreign minister, observed Hitler's speech and wrote in his diary, Hitler must be nervous. The Battle of Britain, fought from July 10th to October 31st, 1940, validated Churchill's gamble. RAF Fighter Command under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding faced odds that should have been insurmountable. The Luftwaffe began the battle with 4,074 available aircraft. The RAF had 1,963. In fighters specifically, the Germans fielded 1,464 fighters against Britain's 903. The RAF faced another critical problem: pilot shortages. By mid-September, Fighter Command had 1,492 operational pilots against an establishment of 1,662. A deficiency of 10%, and many were inexperienced. Dowding implemented a rotation system categorizing squadrons as frontline units at full strength, B, relief units, and C, training units stripped to 5 or 6 pilots. The system was breaking down under the strain. By early September, after weeks of attacks on RAF airfields and sector stations, Vice Marshal Keith Park admitted that damage was extensive and fighting efficiency was being seriously impaired. Fighter Command appeared on the verge of defeat. Then Hitler made his critical error. Infuriated by the Berlin raid and personally fixated on Churchill, he ordered the Luftwaffe to pound London instead of continuing attacks on RAF infrastructure. On September 7th, the Blitz began. Between August 8th and August 26th, the British had destroyed 602 German aircraft while losing 259 fighters. The tide had turned decisively on September 15, 1940, Battle of Britain Day, when the Luftwaffe launched its largest concentrated attack on London, hoping to draw the RAF into a final decisive battle. The Germans expected to encounter a weakened, depleted force. Instead, they met fierce resistance. By evening, the Luftwaffe had lost 75 aircraft. On October 12th, Hitler suspended Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Churchill had been right. Hitler had to invade or fail, and having failed, he would eventually turn east toward Russia and his ultimate destruction. On August 20th, 1940, Churchill delivered another speech to Parliament that captured the nation's gratitude toward RAF Fighter Command. Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. The Battle of Britain cost the Luftwaffe 1,918 aircraft and 2,662 airmen. RAF Fighter Command lost 1,012 aircraft and 537 airmen. The Blitz that followed would kill 43,000 British civilians by May 1941, but the strategic reality was clear. Britain would not be invaded. Hitler's first major defeat was complete. The enduring legacy of Churchill's decision, his mad, reckless, magnificent refusal to accept the rational, cautious counsel of Halifax and others, shaped everything that followed. Had Halifax prevailed, had Britain sought terms in May 1940, the course of history would have been irrevocably altered. Hitler would have controlled all of Europe without significant opposition. The United States, still 18 months away from Pearl Harbor, would have faced a Nazi-dominated Europe with no foothold for future intervention. The Soviet Union, which Hitler invaded in June 1941, might have been defeated without the need for Germany to fight a two-front war. The Holocaust, already beginning with mass shootings in Eastern Europe, would have proceeded without hindrance or witness. The world would have entered what Churchill called a new dark age made more sinister, and perhaps more protracted, by the lights of perverted science. Instead, Churchill's Britain stood alone through 1940 and into 1941, providing the essential proof that Hitler was not invincible. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Britain had already demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could be resisted. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, bringing America into the war, Britain had maintained the Western Front that would eventually become the launching point for D-Day and the liberation of Europe. Churchill's relationship with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin, the Big Three alliance, was built on the foundation of British resistance. As Field Marshal Alan Brooke, who often clashed with Churchill over strategy, wrote, "It is worth all these difficulties to have the privilege to work with such a man. The price of this legacy was paid in blood and suffering. The Blitz devastated British cities. The U-boat campaign nearly starved Britain through 1940, 1941, and 1942. Britain emerged from the war victorious but economically exhausted, its empire beginning the process of dissolution, its position as a global superpower ceded to the United States and Soviet Union. Churchill himself, having led the nation through its darkest and finest hours, was voted out of office in the July 1945 general election. An electorate weary of war and looking ahead to a new Britain chose Labour's vision of social reform over Churchill's Conservative Party. The war had been won, but Churchill's political career seemed finished. Yet history's judgment was unambiguous. The madman Churchill, the reckless warmonger, the man whose judgment was questioned, the political outcast who had spent a decade in the wilderness, the depressive who battled his black dog, the cyclothymic personality who plunged into ventures that more cautious minds rejected. This man had stood at a moment when the rational choice was surrender, when preservation seemed wiser than resistance, when accommodation appeared more sensible than defiance, and he had said no. In the words of Labour politician Hugh Dalton, Churchill was the only man we have for this hour. More than that, he was the man who understood that some hours demand madness over reason, that some moments require one person to believe when all evidence counsels despair, that leadership is sometimes the willingness to risk everything, career, reputation, life itself, on the conviction that freedom matters more than survival. 10 years after the war, Churchill reflected on his role and said of Britain that the nation had the lion's heart, while he merely had the luck to be called upon to give the roar. This was characteristic modesty from a man not known for modesty. The truth was more complex. Britain did have courage, resilience, and determination. But without Churchill's roar, without his speeches that mobilized the English language and sent it into battle, without his personal psychological warfare against Hitler that goaded the Führer into catastrophic errors, without his political maneuvering that prevented Halifax from delivering Britain into negotiated subjugation, that lion's heart might never have found expression. Churchill's madness was in fact a deeper sanity, a prophetic understanding that certain evils cannot be accommodated, that certain tyrannies must be resisted regardless of odds, and that the human spirit, when properly led, can accomplish what statistics and military analysis declare impossible. The final measure of Churchill's achievement came not in 1940 but in the decades that followed. The Europe that emerged from the war, though divided by the Iron Curtain, retained in its western half the democratic institutions and freedoms that Hitler would have extinguished. The Atlantic alliance between Britain and America, forged in the crucible of 1940 to 1941, became the cornerstone of the free world's defense against Soviet totalitarianism. The United Nations, the post-war international order, the gradual decolonization that Churchill both resisted and reluctantly accepted, all of this became possible only because one man, in May 1940, chose to fight rather than negotiate, to risk annihilation rather than accept accommodation, to trust in human resilience rather than surrender to military mathematics. Churchill died on January 24, 1965, at the age of 90. He had lived to see Britain diminished as a global power but free and democratic. He had witnessed the Cold War replace the hot war he had fought, had given that Cold War its defining metaphor, the Iron Curtain, and had warned of Soviet ambitions with the same prophetic insight he had shown about Nazi Germany. He had won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953 for his historical writings, including his 6-volume History of World War II, which ensured that his interpretation of events would dominate for generations. He had been voted the greatest Briton in multiple polls, his speeches still taught in schools, his image synonymous with defiance and determination. But in May 1940, none of that was foreseeable. What was foreseeable was disaster, defeat, occupation, and enslavement. What was foreseeable was a rational acceptance that Britain could not fight Germany alone and must seek terms while it still had bargaining power. What was foreseeable was that Winston Churchill, the man too reckless for high office, too unstable for leadership, too controversial for trust, would destroy whatever remained of his reputation by leading Britain into a doomed resistance that would end with Nazi boots marching through London. Instead, the madman defied Hitler, outmaneuvered Halifax, rallied a nation, inspired the world, and changed history. He offered nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and Britain accepted that offer because, in that moment, nothing else would suffice. He told them they would fight on beaches and landing grounds, in fields and streets and hills, that they would never surrender, and Britain believed him because he believed it first. He told them it was their finest hour, and he was right, but it was also his finest hour, the hour when madness became wisdom, when recklessness became courage, when one man's refusal to accept the inevitable made the inevitable impossible. The Long Island story did not end with each person choking in their own blood upon the ground. Instead, it continued and continues still because Winston Churchill risked it all to defy Hitler and proved that sometimes, the madman is the sanest person in the room.